Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor and privilege to introduce an inaugural panel comprising of eminent guests. I welcome Mr. Vijay Mahajan, CEO of Rajiv Gandhi Foundation and Director of Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies. Mr. Mahajan, editor of this year's State of India's Livelihoods report, is joining with us from the Livelihoods India Secretariat. A very warm welcome to Ms. Shoko Noda, UNDP resident representative in India. And it's a privilege to welcome and introduce Sri Nagendra Nath Sinha, Secretary, Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India. Sri N.N. Sinha is also joined by Ms. Alka Upadhyay and Mr. Vipin Sharma, CEO, Access Development Services at the Ministry of Rural Development at Krishi Bhavan in New Delhi. May I now request you all to stand up for the National Anthem, please.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
On behalf of Access, it is my privilege to welcome you all to the 11th Livelihoods India Summit, being organized with Niti Aayog as the co-host. This is the belated 2020 summit, which was moved from its original schedule of December 2020 in the anticipation that we will be able to organize a physical event as usual. However, as the pandemic grew over time, we had to accept the eventuality and begin planning for a virtual event. So here we are with a packed schedule of enriching deliberations on a diversity of issues relating to livelihoods of the poor. As we are all aware, the pandemic has not left anything untouched, with almost every sector being impacted. India was amongst the worst affected countries, and as expected, the poor and the informal sector are the worst affected when a disaster of this magnitude hits a country. To tackle the challenges posed by the situation, the Government of India announced relief packages that included a slew of employment and social protection measures and economic stimuli, impact of which will be visible in the time to come. Therefore, deliberations in almost all sessions, by design or by default, will have some underlying thread of impact of the pandemic. While some sessions will focus on hardships faced by the communities during the pandemic due to loss of their livelihoods, other sessions will look at strategies for responding to the crisis and building resilience for the future. The summit is designed in a slightly different format this year. In addition to plenary sessions, the technical sessions are integrated into 5 thematic tracks. 2 of those focus on the sectors where the largest number of India's poor are employed, that is agriculture, and more specifically, farmer-producer organizations and the handloom sector. And other 2 tracks are focused on the most vulnerable segments, informal workers and women and their economic empowerment. The 5th track explores the role of CSR in the post-pandemic world. Deliberations in each track will be led by track anchors, followed by technical sessions. Plenary sessions, as always, will cover overarching policy issues with senior sector leaders and policy makers as speakers. We have much to look forward to in terms of fireside chat sessions. The first on day 1, with a new edition of On the Spot with Shiv, where Mr. Shivakumar of ITC will be in conversation with Dr. Saurabh Garg, Principal Secretary Agriculture, on the theme of making agri-markets work. The second on day 2 will see Mr. William Bissell, Chairman of Fab India, in conversation with Ms. Jaya Jaitley, founder of the Sakari Hart Samiti. I hope that you will enjoy and gain from the insightful debates and deliberations, listening to thought leaders, policy makers, and practitioners lined up across the 2 days. Within the obvious limitations of the virtual format, we have made all efforts to make this virtual event interesting. In addition to hosting the sessions, the virtual platform has diverse features for networking, exhibitors at the virtual share fair, and the Resource Center to download various reports and knowledge materials into the delegate briefcase. The 12th Livelihoods India report that will be released in the inaugural session will also be available in the Resource Center for downloading. We have an overwhelming response to the summit this year, despite all challenges, with 600 registrations till yesterday afternoon. I would like to thank all our partners and sponsors for their continued association, particularly in this difficult year, for supporting the summit. I welcome all speakers and thank them for their time and effort. I hope you'll all enjoy this new format of the summit. That was a brief introduction to the year summit. We'll now move on to the customary release of the State of India's Livelihood Report 2020 edition. The State of India's Livelihood Report is an annual publication addressing the contemporary issues emerging in the livelihood sector. It is the only document that aggregates the experiences and challenges of the sector, analyzes case studies, and reports on the progress of both government and privately run programs. Given the diversity of themes that are covered in the State of India's Livelihood Report, as in the past 2 years, this year's report has been put together by a group of authors: Dr. Ashok Sarkar, S. Sivakumar, Shashtant Patara, Kanika Verma, Vrinda Chopra, Dr. Sanjeev Fansalkar, Rajiv Khandelwal with his team at Ajivika Bureau, Shriya Mojumdar, Dr. Smita Premchandar, Andrila Roy Chaudhary, and Deepika Pingali. The report has been edited by Mr. Vijay Mahajan. I'm extremely grateful to our sponsors, NABARD, and our knowledge partner, Rabobank, who have been steadfast in their support to the report over the past few years. I now request Mr. Vipin Sharma to present a copy of the State of India's Livelihoods Report to Shri NN Sinha for release. I also request Ms. Shoko Noda and Mr. Vijay Mahajan to unwrap their copies of the report for release and hold up for a screenshot picture.
On behalf of Access, I also once again thank Mrs. Sinha for agreeing to be in this inaugural session and to allow us space within his office to do the inaugural session.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I thank all the dignitaries for that release of the latest edition of State of India's Livelihoods Report. I now request Mr. Vijay Mahajan to share the key highlights from the State of India's Livelihoods Report 2020 on behalf of the authors and on his own behalf.
Shri Sinha, Srimati Upadhyay, Madam Shoko Noda, and lots of members in the audience whom I can't see, but I'm told there are over 500 of you there. Thank you very much for turning up here. I apologize for wearing a cap. I have a head cold, and it's the only way I can sort of continue not to feel congested. So I'm going to be presenting the highlights of the report that has just been unveiled in front of you. I'll take only about 15 minutes. Let me just share the screen. This one. Is that visible on screen? Pooja? Pooja has already mentioned that this is the work of a number of people who she just named, so I won't repeat them, but they are highlighted. And I want to mention that it was truly a collaborative effort. I enjoyed reading their drafts and arguing with them, and they arguing with me in turn and improving each other's thinking on the matter. So what we are offering to you is truly a collective response. The main thing, however, that we agreed with Mr. Vipin Sharma, who is the spirit behind all of this, is that when he met me about 2.5 months ago to talk about this, I said, the state of India's livelihoods is something we talk of every year. This has been a very, very difficult year. And let's talk about the future. So I, in fact, insisted that we should call it the FOIL, the future of India's livelihoods for 2030. But eventually, since we have to do a status report as well, so we decided, okay, let's look at the state of India's livelihoods, but let's look at a trajectory towards 2030 and a trajectory for inclusive livelihoods. And it makes a nice summary in terms of all the work that we're to do. So there's a long toil to 2030. India has had a proud record of fairly high GDP growth rate, among the highest in the large economies all of the last 2 decades. So it did slow down a bit, but we ended the 2 decades with a 7.4% per annum compounded annual growth rate. Unfortunately, employment grew at only 1% per annum, actually 0.98. So even though the GDP grew and quite robustly, employment did not grow. This is what was widely called jobless growth. But sadly, in 2020, the GDP fell quite understandably due to the COVID pandemic. The latest NSO estimates released about 20 days ago have brought down the fall from earlier expected 10% plus to minus 7.7%. But that led to a severe reduction in jobs. Of course, at the peak in May, there were as many as 8 crore people out of jobs. But by the end of the year, by end of December, the employment had fallen by 1.6 crores, 16 million. And there were already 32 million unemployed people. So we ended the year, or we entered this year, with 4.8 crore people, 48 million people actively looking for work. Now that itself is a huge task for any nation. But in addition, as we'll describe later, there is of course the incremental growth in the labor force. So we have a huge task, which I'll talk about later. But let me talk about the quality of livelihoods. Broadly, it is inadequate, a point that I've already made out of 52 crore labor force by the end of December 2020. Only 47.2 crores were workers, rest were unemployed. Workers are that part of the labor force who are working. The others are unemployed, looking for work. Agricultural employment, and I put that within quotes because a lot of them are actually self-employed farmers, accounted for about 45% of the total employment. But the last data that we have for incomes, and this is very, very relevant because of all that's going on the borders of Delhi, the average monthly household income of farmers in 2013, as measured by an All India National Sample Survey, was 6,426. And their expenditure was 6,223. And this is income from all sources, not just from farming. And yet, about 2/3 of these accounted, of about 9 crore farmers, earned less than what they spent. That means their income from all sources was actually below their minimum expenditure. So the distress of the agricultural classes is actually nationwide. And, what we are seeing around the borders of Delhi is actually one particular segment, which is actually at the higher end of these incomes. But even they have various grievances. But the agriculture sector as a whole and the farming class as a whole is seriously income deficit, and we need to do something about it. And within that, there are roughly 11 crore landless people for whom the informal sector, through migration and the NREGA program, is the employment of last resort. And I must take this opportunity in the presence of Mr. Sinha and Madam Upadhyay that MG Narega was truly a life savior in 2020. And the government's efforts to both increase the outlay from 61,000 crores to over 1 lakh crores, as well as to promote a system of new job cards for returning migrants, as well as starting works in almost all the districts, was really helpful. And the MG Narega website is actually a dream for anyone who wants to talk about transparency in detail in government. I mean, literally on 11th of January, I could see village-wise data of which works were on and how many workers were working there and so on. And many places we did on the ground quick audits, and indeed all of that was true. So, in a nation where we keep talking about the degradation of our public systems, I think it's very important to acknowledge that lots of things did work. The public distribution system worked, the interbank payment system worked, the telecommunication system worked, the Narega system worked, and of course, the electricity and water system worked. Imagine if any of these had failed, what the pandemic would have done to the nation's situation. Yet, going back to the livelihood issue, the issue of earnings, which I had mentioned for farmers already, is equally true for those who were self-employed, for example, in crafts work or any of other non-farm activities in rural areas. You could see that the average self-employed male earned about 9,000 rupees per month. The average self-employed female earned only about 4,000 in 2017-18. This is all data based on the periodic labor force survey of 2017-18. In urban areas, 38% of all workers were self-employed, and the gross earnings were 16,000 among males and less than half among females. So as you can see, the rural-urban differential of nearly 76% for self-employment and 104% through casual work. I'm not sharing that data, but the differential is 104%. In addition to more opportunities in urban areas, explains the urban pull. People keep asking, why do so many people migrate from rural to urban areas? Well, if you get double the income, even with additional costs and indeed definitely lower standards of living, you still want to go there because you have greater opportunities. Another point to note is the male-female wage differential. As I said, it's almost 50%. And this partly explains why we have a low female labor force participation rate. If you pay so low, it is better for a woman not to do any paid work and just be at home and do things like whatever she can do to support the family, rather than be counted as employed as a casual worker. In addition, as you can see, 57% were self-employed, only 13% in rural areas and 46% in urban areas had regular wages. But even among them, half did not have any social security benefit. No paid leave, no maternity leave, no creches, no health or life cover, no ASI, no PF, no pension. All the stuff that we middle-class professionals are accustomed to. In terms of decency or indecency, as many as 95% of women workers in the informal sector suffered abuse and sexual harassment at the workplace, as per a study by Human Rights Watch. And we all know about the safety hazards in other occupations like construction, sanitation, etc., with the regular deaths. So the state of India's livelihoods is inadequate, insecure, and indecent. I want to thank Professor Ashok Sarkar for pointing out these four things, although in a different sequence, but I have a pancha for acronyms, so I turned it around. So what dogs India's livelihoods are the following four things. First is the demographic disappointment. The so-called dividend has been declared, but it's not been paid. The occupational aspirations. People want a government job, any job, but not self-employment. There is a geographic mismatch. Workers are in Bharat, jobs are in India. And there are many, many perverse incentives at the sector and the firm level which discourage employing labor. In the main report, there's a lot more detail about this. I will not go into this, but in some ways, these are the four macroeconomic features, and I owe also to Professor Sanjeev Fansalkar, Rajiv Khandelwal to contribute to this thinking. The challenges, therefore, for this decade are that we need 12 crore new livelihoods. Now, this number I'm not saying lightly. I have a full quantitative model underlying this estimate, and I shall make it available for scrutiny to anybody who wants it. But the fact is, this 12 crore new livelihoods includes the 4.8 crore of current unemployed at the beginning of January 21, plus the increments to the labor force, which fortunately will be lower than the previous decade because of reduction in population growth rate. But despite that, we will have almost 9 crore new people joining the labor force. So 9 plus 4.8 is 13.8. And I'm assuming that there will be still some residual unemployment of about 2 to 3%. So after taking that into account, we still need 12 crore new livelihoods. So we need to promote growth with employment and for the neglected demographic segments, particularly women, particularly the youth, particularly people like the disabled and the minorities. And we need to do this by spreading employment opportunities spatially. We have to go, as Rajiv has put famously in his report, metros are retro. We need to generate livelihood opportunities. Unfortunately, not in the idealistic Gandhian concept of village industries. That's not feasible in today's economy in most cases. But at least small town employment. We have over 5,000 small towns as per census 2011. In 2021, we'll probably have 6,000 plus. They need to become the new growth centers. And of course, we need high growth sectors for generating employment. In the report, we have indeed identified these sectors and indeed computed sectoral output. This is on page 19 of the report. Once again, the quantitative model is available for scrutiny. So perhaps the gods can help. The gods are the greening of India, the opportunities for new skilled jobs in high growth sectors, digital services, particularly for the next generation, the youth, who are already much more digital savvy, but also for women, because digital work also enables working from home, working at your own time, and therefore it's suited in some ways to the fact that the reproductive role of women is not going to go away. And working out of home in hard physical work has often meant doubling their workload. And finally, as I mentioned, the spatial distribution of livelihoods. So the fact is that the gods help only those who help themselves. So we have to be Atmanirbhar. And indeed, our Prime Minister did include that, announce that as the new policy approach. And we've translated that into an 8-fold path for sustainable livelihoods for all by 2030. They are all listed here, but I'll run through them very quickly. So the first is transform agriculture from subsistence to sustainable. or in case of Punjab and Haryana, from subsidized to sustainable. So in Punjab and Haryana, it is not subsistence agriculture, but it is actually seriously dependent on subsidies, both on the input and output side. And the only way we can do this is by spending about 2% of our GDP on regeneration of degraded natural resources. The Jal Jangal Zameen of India badly needs reinvestment. And if we invest in that through NREGA and other sources, then we will actually regenerate the very basis for livelihoods. Then, of course, as Shiv Kumar has argued, we need a fundamental transformation of the system from being production led supply chains supported by the government to demand responsive value chains, which are anchored by consumer oriented market players. In other words, we have to bring in private capital into agriculture. And one of the issues that the nation is currently has to sit down and debate is that the government, of course, can't pay for the transformation of agriculture that is needed. Who will pay for it? And if we have to bring the private sector into it, what terms can we bring them in such that they find it attractive enough and yet it's not exploitative of farmers? And I think that's the debate that we need to engage in or discussion rather than what is going on. We need to practice the 3 R's for greening of India. Regeneration of natural resources, I already talked about, Jal Jangal Zameen. But we need significant enhancement of the renewable energy generation. India is already one of the leaders in solar power generation. But there is also wind, there is also hydel, and there is also biomass and biogas. And then, of course, recycling of waste. We need to recognize that this will generate lots and lots of jobs. In fact, there are detailed estimates of jobs that are possible in waste recycling, both in rural and urban areas. The third point, of course, is to make school education, skill and entrepreneurship training effective. We've again, in the last 20 years, achieved tremendous, sort of enrollment rates in both primary and secondary school education. However, the learning outcomes are not very good, as we know from the ESSER surveys. And this should be the decade when we say we are going to fix the quality problem in school education. As a nation, that must be our prana. And since everybody can't then go on to do a BA or a MSc or a PhD, we need to seriously focus on vocational training and in the following high growth sectors which I identified, including agricultural services and agro-processing, construction, creative and craft enterprises, which Shreya Majumdar has written in great detail in her chapter, manufacturing, both small scale, for which I have argued in great detail, but also high end, as we also need to be present in the global economy, and what I call proximate services, which require face-to-face services like retail trade, logistics, tourism, social services, health and education, but also the digital version of these services, which will generate millions of jobs and tremendous access. Atmanirbhar is depend on yourself. We don't need to depend on the government for everything. We've got to get past that mentality. And the greatest example of this is the self-help group movement. In 1987, I was lucky to establish some of the first self-help groups in North India. In fact, it was a pilot project with the Ministry of Rural Development. When Mr. Vinod Pandey was the secretary in your place. And today, I'm happy to say that there are roughly 1 crore, little more than 1 crore self-help groups in the country. And, they receive thousands of crores. Last year, they received about 56,000 crores of credit from banks. That's a classic example of Atmanirbharta. But being Atmanirbhar should not be seen as being alone. So along with Atmanirbhar, we have to organize. Farmers have to be organized into FPOs, farmer producer companies particularly, and not just for input purchase and raw output sale. They must participate in the full value chain, of which Amul again is an outstanding example of both Atmanirbharta and organizing of farmers. Agro-processing units should be owned 100% by farmer-producer companies. How that capital will reach them is a technical question. I've worked on that issue for many years. It can be done. And these companies need to be managed by professionals, once again, the way we've learned from Amul. But only if farmers own the value chain fully will they get a fair share of the agriculture produce. It's not a matter of minimum support prices. If you sell your produce at the farm gate, irrespective of what the price is, it is still basically being a surrogate mother. Moving on, we need to develop Samarth Zillas around smart cities. In fact, we should have begun with Samarth Zillas and then the cities could have been made smart. Right now, as we saw in the COVID period, the cities turned out to be not so smart after all, and people had to go back to their Zillas. How many and how, it's a detailed matter, it's there in the report, but I don't have the time to discuss it here. But we have done a study of 10 states and 20 districts to indicate how Samarth Zillas can be created. And finally, we have to move beyond putting the government at the center to putting the community at the center. And around it, at least 5 of us have to hold hands and work for development. I call it in English a collaborative Pentagon because it can have more than 5, it can have 5 sides, but in Hindi, the term is Panchmukhi Samvai, and the 5 corners of the 5 sides of the Pentagon are the government, of course, the corporate sector, civil society institutions, capital markets, because we do need capital, and knowledge institutions. I separate capital markets from the corporate sector because there's a very big difference. The capital markets are significantly funded by household savings. We must not forget that. We are the source of the capital market, not its recipients. So we need to distinguish analytically between the corporate sector and the capital markets. Finally, financing. I am a Mahajan, as you know, so I have to think in terms of money. How do we finance all this and how much is required? Once again, my quantitative model has done the estimation. If we want livelihoods for all by 2030, we need to invest 120 lakh crores, which is about 60% of India's GDP in 2020, the reduced GDP. And this investment needs to be made in the first 6 years of this decade if we have to get the results by the end, which means 10% of today's GDP every year would have to be spent on creating new livelihoods. Now, the good news is this is not expected from the government. And most of this is going to come from household savings through the banking system. And I don't want to scare you, but here is the details of it. And this is only the summary of the capital of the table. So I will not go into the detail, but the calculations are available for scrutiny. So this is the third time I've had the opportunity to talk about livelihoods in India. In 1995, I did the Rural Non-Farm Sector Report, which was in fact sponsored by NABARD. I'm very thankful that they have sponsored this report as well. In 2008, Vipin had asked me to write the overview chapter for the first State of India's livelihood report. And in that as well, I had argued for a strategy for inclusive livelihoods. As far as I'm concerned, this is the last and final call. Unless we invest that 1,20,000 crore, the 120 lakh crores, which is 10% of India's GDP, we will have hell to pay by 2030. But if we do, we will end up with a GDP for India, which is green, digital, and people-centered. And I hope we will move towards that ideal rather than move towards the dystopia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mahajan, for helping bring together the report and for the crisp presentation, bringing together the key points from across the chapters. A big thank you also to all the authors for their contribution in putting together this well-researched report. Now it's time for us to hear from our esteemed speakers of the inaugural session. I request Ms. Shoko Noda, UNDP resident representative in India, to kindly address the virtual gathering. Ms. Shoko Noda.
Yes, thank you very much for these opportunities, and I'm really delighted to be part of the Livelihood India Summit this year with distinguished panelists, speakers, and also an excellent presentation of the report. Such a rich information and thoughts and visions are in the report. So I look really forward to reading this report. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I also would like to thank Access Development Services for hosting this event at the time when the whole world is really grappling with uncertainties, and it's really heartening to see so many people, so many institutions come together to co-create, reimagine a better future for all. When I say all, yes, all. And including less privileged ones. Well, COVID-19, we all know that it has been an unprecedented health, but also development crisis, and especially a crisis of livelihood. It's very, very obvious. And it's just, for me, sad to see that, it has jeopardized India's tremendous and proud gains in reducing poverty. For example, for the past 10 years, India has succeeded in reducing about 275 million people. We lifted that many people from poverty. And if we do the survey now, I'm not sure how many are still remaining above poverty line. So it is really a level illustration for those who are less privileged. And pandemic has also overloaded vulnerable and health systems and put frontline workers in health, sanitation, and civil society organizations at risk. I have also met those sanitation workers myself, and then see the very vulnerable working environment that they operate in. They have no other choice, but they have to continue. Although the lockdown has also severely impacted lives and livelihoods, and installed economic activities, and exposed MSMEs to a significant operational and financial risks. So as a consequence, informal workers, farmers, artisans, people who are on the fringe, and those living in poverty are highly vulnerable to falling into poverty or facing deepening poverty, hunger, illness, homelessness, and the social stigma. These increased social and economic burdens have and will continue to aggravate the pressures on families, increase the burdens of caregiving of women, increase vulnerability to gender-based violence, you just name it. Reports indicate that the crisis will have severe negative impacts on most of the sustainable development goals, particularly SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 3, health, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. So as UNDP, we're taking this situation as the crisis in this decade and then within this 15 years of SDGs. Despite economic growth, millions of women and girls continue to face several socioeconomic barriers and have been left behind in many ways. Female participation in the country's workforce was already low we heard already from the presentation, just 20% according to the World Bank report. So the COVID crisis has further magnified these inequalities. Obviously, the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women and threatens to roll back the progress made with respect to women's economic empowerment. Even after 8 months of the initial lockdown, and the current situation, data shows that 13 fewer women than a year ago were employed or looking for jobs compared to 2% fewer men. And the pandemic and consequent economic crisis have also resulted in a sudden downturn in economic activities and led to over 122 million job losses, mostly in informal sectors. We all know women employed as domestic helps at construction sites and handicrafts and retail units have lost their jobs. And at the same time, women micro and small entrepreneurs have struggling to survive. It's encouraging to see that India has invested vast resources in girls' education and women's employment, but we now need to really come together and work towards sustaining the gains that we have made in these areas. Mr. Vijay, you just also mentioned about digital as a key driver. Again, here there is a digital inequality globally and in India. Less women have digital access as well as skills. It's very obvious. And again, investment to digitally empower women is extremely important. So I'm so glad that the report also points out. Through my own work, the past 22 years in UN and personal experiences, it takes time to empower women. It doesn't happen tomorrow, even if we all recognize and recognize how important it is. It is a daily, it's a daily, monthly, weekly, monthly, these efforts that we have to make every day. Then we will see some results. So it's very important that we continue to invest funding, but also time and provide space for women. For UNDP, yes, empowering women is enhancing their livelihood opportunities has been always a top priority. We have drawn on its long-standing experiences globally as well as India to strengthen the health system response to COVID and expand access to social protection for the vulnerables. We are working to facilitate access to information, finance, markets to nearly 200,000 households in 56 districts across 9 states. I know that in a vast country like India, it's not. It's just a small part of compared with the whole the needs. But we'll continue to do our best to support this area, and we are with you. So there are some learning from our previous projects, especially the project called Disha, and I just would like to share some of the key learnings from this project that are relevant maybe in the context of reconstructing livelihood and expanding access to jobs. First, it's very critical to invest in local jobs and livelihoods, including through micro, small, and medium enterprises. I think it's just obvious, but just wanted to reiterate this point, and this is to provide the widest possible access to long-term opportunities. Second, investing in specialized skilling programs such as 21st century skills set, digital marketing, and managerial roles enables enhanced access to employment and growth of micro enterprises. Empowering vulnerable women and building their self-confidence. And really, I would like to stress the importance of self-confidence. And this will increase their likelihood of finding and keeping a job or starting business. And the building self-confidence, this process cannot be also done only in classrooms. It has to come from families, family at the family level. It's very important that all of us have important role to play. So UNDP's has been working closely with partners. I'm so grateful to see many of our partners here and communities across the state to rebuild livelihood. We trained 20,500 people in entrepreneurship. We also supported women groups in Maharashtra to make 150,000 masks that generated about 14 lakh rupees. We provided 8 food processing machines to help 10,000 tribal women in Madhya Pradesh to increase their, of course, incomes, provided online career guidance to over 86,000 women and youth. And we could not have done it without the partnership with many of you. So just would like to thank you once again for coming together and then doing it together. We need to really fasten our seatbelts to create more and more opportunities for entrepreneurship and skilling in rural and then urban India. This cannot be done in isolation. So as I said, strategic partnership is very, very important, and we are open to expand our partnership. Given our common vision, I strongly believe that collaborative actions like the Livelihood India Summit is helping us achieve better results and ensure that no one is left behind. So today's discussion is really a step forward in very important milestone in that direction. So once again, thank you very, very much, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shoko Noda, for that insightful special address touching upon the impact of pandemic, especially on the most vulnerable segments, and the key drivers for building resilience and reconstruction of livelihoods as emerging from UNDP's experience in India. Finally, it's time to hear from Mr. N.N. Sharma, Sinha, Secretary, Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India. I request Mr. Sinha to kindly deliver his inaugural address.
Mr. Bipin Sharma, the President, Access Development Services, Mrs. Alka Upadhyay, Additional Secretary, and my colleague in the ministry, Ms. Shoko Noda, the UNDP country representative, Mr. Vijay Mahajan, founder, Basic Social Enterprises Limited, and the participants in 2020 Livelihoods India Virtual Summit. I'm indeed privileged that you invited me to the inaugural event of this summit and asked me to deliver the keynote address. The 11 previous editions of the Livelihood India Summits and the State of India's Livelihood Report, they've all been excellent documents, and anyone going through them gets a fairly good idea of what needs to be done in order to address the livelihood situation across the country, across the rural and the urban areas, across the demographies and geographies. And I'm sure going by the glimpse presented by Mr. Mahajan, it's going to be no different. And I'm quite happy to note, and I shared this with Mr. Sharma, that many of the ideas presented in Mr. Mahajan's overview resonated quite well with what we think about this. So let me begin my address. And obviously, I will present from the Rural Development Ministry's point of view. It's not going to be a comprehensive summary and overview as presented by Mr. Mahajan. But then, since bulk of the people for whom we need to provide for job are in the rural areas, and therefore quite a lot of it will certainly address those issues and concerns. India has made impressive gains on income poverty. The World Bank estimates indicate extreme poverty dropping from 46% to an estimated 13.4%. These gains are also reflected in 27% reduction in multi-dimensional poverty, according to the Global MPI report prepared by the United Nations Development Programme and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. This could be possible as targeting substantially improved with the use of SECC. Focused beneficiary targeting added by universal access to various programs, use of DBT, leveraging Jandhan, Aadhaar and mobile, the JAM Trinity, use of digital technologies for monitoring and progress tracking made huge gains in progress as is visible in success of multiple programs like Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin, Ujjwala, Saubhagya, NFSA. The government's success in expanding social security and social protection with reduced leakage has addressed many basic issues in the rural areas. This, together with the better education and connectivity, has moved the aspirational ladder and the expectations from rural development programs. Imperatives to eradicate rural poverty has been boldly stated in New India 2020 vision. Disaggregated data indicate poverty intensity and concentration in rural and central, small and marginal farmer, farm laborers, gender specifically women-headed households, the scheduled castes and tribes. Urban migration, particularly of youth, diversification in the rural economy, increasing feminization of poverty with women taking to unremunerative and riskier farming livelihoods characterize the changing face of rural India. India aims to become a $5 trillion economy by 2025. The context of rapid growth is accompanied by formalization of economy and asks for new efficiency and scale paradigm for rural enterprises to be competitive. The SHG movement has come a long way in the past couple of decades, as was noted by Mr. Mahajan, that starting from about 100 SHGs in 1985, and today we stand over a crore SHGs. The efforts made by some of the leading civil society organizations, the state governments, and now DAY and RLM, working under the aegis of the MORD, has led to mobilization of more than 72 million women into 6.6 million self-help groups in the rural areas under the aegis of the program. And there are several more, as has been mentioned. The livelihood intervention strategy under DAY and RLM is one of the most dynamic and still evolving in congruence with the farm and non-farm sector, now changing rapidly to keep pace with the global economy, and more specifically, the 21st century needs. The labor force participation rate of women is low. It's one of the important reasons for our lackluster economic activity in some respects. In most of the developed or middle income societies, the labor force participation is high and at least above 50%. For most of the developed world and China, it's above 50%, and for China, it's about 60%. For India, it hovers around 20%. The COVID saw it drop to about 10% for the rural women, the group which our program caters to, from about 11.6% a year earlier, as per reports from the CMIE. A report from Oxfam released just a few days ago estimated that unemployment rate among women has risen from 15% to 18% post-COVID, and there has been a GDP loss of about 218 billion, which in their estimation is about 8% of the GDP. Those who stayed in the employment also suffered loss of income. Clearly, these are very disturbing numbers and encourage and provoke us to work harder. Although the target group that our NRLM program caters to is the women, clearly we are addressing households as livelihoods of women add to income of the family, and most importantly are spent in improving the family welfare through a variety of pathways. Thus, encouraging livelihood development is one of the surest ways of addressing the rural development and for mitigation of the poverty. NRLM reaches about 72 million women across the India. In the next phase of growth, focus is on taking the present livelihood outreach of about 14%. About 11 million women are currently reached by the livelihood programs and component of the NRLM to universalize and leaving no SHG women through a mix of strategies, including enablement at all levels, pivoting the livelihood target setting, pathways and delivery systems, including digital, and creating immersion grounds in select states. In order to make a dent in poverty, it is necessary to ensure that every family that gets associated with NRLM is supported with at least one additional livelihood option. This is a goal quite closely linked with the one led by Honorable Prime Minister for the 75th anniversary of our independence in 2022, of every poor family having at least one source of livelihood. The challenge is how do we do it when with the interventions that we have had till now, we have been able to reach only one woman out of every 7 women with the program. Thus, then we have the issue of differing endowment with the families in different parts of the country and high level of landlessness in several parts of the country. That makes it kind of mandatory to encourage non-farm jobs, and these were very well elaborated in the presentation made by Mr. Mahajan. Intensification strategy needs to be adopted to specific requirement of each state, taking into account the leveraging of women mobilized into SHG and their supporting associated tiers, emerging restructuring of the farm economy, government policies and new investment opportunities beyond agriculture, livestock and enterprise, and taking whole of rural approach. Agriculture growth is critical for the economic empowerment of women, as close to the 80% of the all economically active women are in the agriculture sector, comprising 33% of the agriculture labor force and 48% of the self-employed farmers. About 18% of the farm families in India, according to the NSSO, are reported to be headed by women. Day NRLM mobilization of women across 6,379 blocks presents an intervention opportunity for large-scale farm growth and also economic empowerment of our women. Our understanding is that Indian agriculture is in midst of many significant changes and is poised to address declining incomes and increased risk due to price volatility and climate variability. The convergence across agriculture and rural development and panchayats, there is an expectations that and the efforts in the NRLM has to factor these new developments. The existing livelihood mix for the SHG family is primarily characterized by rain-fed agriculture through single crop cultivation, supplemented by animal husbandry, remittance income, and non-farm services, including artisanal activities. Diversification into high-value agriculture, animal husbandry, and related fields for which there is an internal market potential would be necessary to reduce vulnerability and supplement incomes. Increasing productivity of existing rural livelihood systems and introducing new options are interrelated subcomponents. Transferring appropriate knowledge and skill to improve the productivity of existing crops is critical. Further, to sustain adoption, it will be important to encourage development of clusters around single crop in contiguous geographical areas. Crops could be chosen on the basis of soil, water, climate, market assessment, and include pulses, oilseeds, spices, fruits, and flowers apart from the cereal crops. In order to reach and provide for livelihood, I think and we think that following broad arenas of interventions could be addressing this gap. Massification and saturation outreach. We remember that in about 5 to 10 years earlier, the microcredit planning was the key strategy for reaching the poor households. So now we need to shift from microcredit planning to livelihood planning for the families, and which would certainly have a component of credit planning, ensuring timely access to credit and support for productivity increase in the dominant crop public livestock of the area. This would entail creating a simple set of practices with maximum impact on yield and building capacities of the entire NRLM delivery system around this, and revamp planning and tracking system. This will have planned outreach of reaching about 80% of the membership with an additional productivity increase of about 30%, translating to income increase of about 20%, or an average of 8,000 to 10,000 per annum per family. In several parts of the country, notably Andhra Pradesh, adoption of zero budget natural farming and pre-monsoon dry sowing techniques have not only brought cost reduction in farming, but also increased resilience and productivity. These set of techniques also increase dietary diversity and thereby lead to improved nutrition. Thus, these, when combined with watershed-based approaches, can further enhance the productivity. At this moment, most of the NRLM livelihoods that we can probably plan on a large scale fit in this strategy, having been promoted under MKSP, agroecological practices strategy. The other strategy that we talk of is about livelihood intensification. This is aimed to have an outreach of about 30% of the SHG members with bouquet of low intensity capital inputs and markets interventions, aiming to leverage existing resource endowments, land, water, and livestock, skills, and local market systems to bring an additional average income of about 15,000 per annum per family. This could include homestead-based livelihood intensification, vegetable, trees, livestock, backyard livestock, poultry, goat, duck, pig, fish, etc. intensification. Then there is another set of interventions which could take integrated farming cluster approach, which could generate an additional income of about 25,000 per family, and this could address about 15% of the total family. And then the last set of strategy would be market-linked acceleration and development of producer groups around a commodity in a contiguous geographical area would be the key. Choice of crops or commodities could be based on assessment of natural resources, skills, and market linkages. Using successful models in the country, new crops, for example, fruits, flowers, fibers, sericulture, etc., could be explored. These can be organized into producer groups, and based on the opportunity, they can be linked to value chain development efforts or farmer-producer organization. These are high-intensity interventions, and an outreach of about 5% can be planned around this with an additional income increase of 50,000 per annum. In order to support SHG members for better market access, when at the current stage producer collectives are being promoted, around 175 producer enterprises which are already registered have already been promoted for commodities like milk, fruits and vegetables, pulses, cereals. In several areas where the number of producers is not so large and not so significant, thereby enabling us to create the large size producer enterprise, producer groups are being promoted to market the produce in the local market. Till date, about 26,000 producer groups have been promoted, and we plan to have about 40 to 50,000 more producer groups in the next 4 to 5 years. In this, we have been assisted by the National Rural Economic Transformation Project, which is supported by the World Bank for supporting forward value chain development, and which has financed and about 10 value chain projects with a total budget outlay of about 181 crores in 5 states, in which about 1.89 lakh women producers are to be covered in the coming 3 years time period. Then this begs the question as to whether it's just the capital or we need to also increase the livelihood assets. There is certainly clearly a great need of the livelihoods assets, and quite a lot of it will certainly come from the watershed based approaches, but then there are issues, for example, assets that promote livestock or fruit or fiber. These need to be supported by Mahatma Gandhi Narega, and they are indeed being supported by Mahatma Gandhi Narega. We see that about 50 to 60% of the assets are being financed out of the Mahatma Gandhi Narega. But then there is also a need of accessing private capital at reasonable costs and prices to add to the stock of capital and assets in the rural areas. We estimate that about 10% of the SHG can be supported from the Mahatma Gandhi Narega, but about 90% need to come from other sources of. Then the issue of extension capacity is also very critical, and indeed we see that not only there is a lack of dynamism in the government or public extension services, and we have also seen that there is a decline in the numbers available. So the Rural Development Ministry has, under the NRLM, promoted livelihood CRPs, for example, Krishi Sakhi, Pasu Sakhi, Mat Sakhi, Van Sakhi. So they are being deployed across the country and are supporting the women farmers, the Mahila Kisans. Then we have also very recently launched the Nsqf aligned Agripreneurship courses. In fact, they were started on 18th January 2021. And the last one was held about a week ago. And they are addressing the livestock and the fishery sector. And these entrepreneurs would support the farmers with not only supply of inputs or marketing of their produce, but would also provide a lot of technical inputs to the farmers that they support. The convergence is the key, as has been noted by Mr. Mahajan in his review. And we are promoting convergence not only within the program, but also across the program and across the sectors. So, for example, we have developed the convergence framework with Ministry of Agriculture for quality seed saplings, seedlings, awareness on soil testing, organic farming, establishment of digital soil testing, establishment of the custom hiring centers, agri-processing units, and promotion of FPOs as part of the scheme on promotion of 10,000 FPOs. Then we have entered into convergence framework with DA, Department of Agriculture, Animal Husbandry and Dairy for supporting vaccination, feed and fodder, deworming goats and birds, animal health camp, castration of goats and birds, etc. And then artificial insemination, and there are many other areas. And then we have also entered into similar convergence frameworks and agreements with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. We propose to enter one with Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment for addressing the scheduled caste and the OBC communities. And then we have also similar collaboration in the area of food processing with the Ministry of Food Processing Industry. But I think, as was noted by Mr. Mahajan, the scope of convergence goes much beyond, and it includes, especially for market-linked production, variety of livelihoods working with processors, agri-tech players, large format retailers, aggregators, and so on, so that the farmer, through greater control over production and aggregation, and heavily supported by production and marketing intelligence and inputs, farm gate processing and storage investment, facilitated to no less extent by recent government decisions on FPOs, agriculture and animal husbandry infrastructure fund, promotion of medicinal plants, apiary, etc., could keep a very substantial portion of the value chains. These would also be essential, as though many domestic and regional markets seem to saturate, global demand for production of processed food, organic food, etc., would continue to be high. And therefore, if we are able to raise the standardize the kind of goods that we produce, we can indeed become very significant players. The policy of one district, one product would also go a long way in promoting these investment and areas of livelihood. Striking such partnership is essential, and therefore we call upon various players to come forward and link with us and the program for greater market share, besides purposeful, impactful investment of diverse local and unique products. There are livelihoods which come from the non-farm livelihood sectors. And indeed, for many of the households, particularly in the eastern parts of the country, the degree of landlessness is high, and the landholding among the farmers is small. Therefore, the non-farm livelihood interventions would go a long way in supporting these kind of people. The Day NRLM has been supporting SHG members to start enterprises in the non-farm livelihood sector through the Startup Village and Entrepreneurship program, which support the development of an ecosystem for entrepreneurship development. It is being implemented in about 182 blocks in 29 states and union territories, and has supported about 1.26 lakh enterprises till date. Both vertical and horizontal expansions are being planned simultaneously. The one-stop facility centers will be set up to provide higher order business advisory to grow businesses, leveraging loans from banks, mentorship supports, market linkages. It is expected that around 50,000 enterprises will be supported through 150 one-stop facility centers. The concept of rural incubators will also be implemented initially in about 4 or 5 states, and thereafter it will be diversified and expanded to about 13 states. And we hope that these incubators will support about 100 to 150 rural enterprises in each state. Day NRLM will adopt a value chain approach to develop handloom and handicraft clusters, wherein the investment will be channeled based on the need and will focus on the soft components like product development, marketing. We propose to develop around 40 clusters with an investment of 200 crores in coming 2 years. Clusters will also be developed for the food business, take-home ration units, etc., in various parts of the country. We also see that there are areas which generate out of the waste or forest produce or agriculture produce, which can become good sources of investment. For example, bamboo can provide various products, for example, cutleries, for example, activated charcoal, etc. So these could become significant sources of non-farm livelihoods in many parts of the country. Then the Department of Food has invited us to make the cutleries out of the bagasse, and there could be many other waste to wealth kind of activities which can come out and which could form many non-farm livelihoods. But there is a large scope for expanding non-farm livelihood interventions, and we certainly invite the livelihood sectors and experts to deliberate about it as to how we can go about it on a very large scale. Mr. Mahajan mentioned about the Atmanirbhar districts, which could be centered around the smart cities. We have one program which is based on similar principle. These are called urban clusters. We have about 300 urban clusters. It has made significant strides in augmenting the social and economic infrastructure in selected clusters since its launch. Drawing from the success of the initiative and towards an enhanced vision of harnessing the growth potential of the urban areas, the program is expanding to develop about 1,000 additional clusters. The key thrust is planned spatial development, which will focus on economic growth, utilizing the locational advantages, leveraging technologies and innovation. And in each cluster, a set of 3 core activities would harnesses the rural-urban economic continuum, urban microeconomic zones, youth employment service hubs, and facilities hub. The focus is on providing opportunities for local enterprise development and localized employment generation. In each cluster, economic potential arising from locational advantages, competitiveness, and economies of scale is being identified, which will be provided from end-to-end support with essential backward and forward linkages. Marketing support to SHG entrepreneurs will be one of the focus areas in the coming years. We have tried to use government e-marketplace as one of the platforms for SHG entrepreneurs, and around 1,000 SHGs have onboarded their products, and there certainly this can be expanded to many more e-commerce players, and we need to utilize this. Since the time is limited, so I wouldn't like to dwell on the work that has been done by the NRLM community during the COVID. So let me come to the last part of the issue that I wanted to dwell on. The need for investment in this area is large. We hadn't done the computation. We are indeed fortunate that Mr. Mahajan had done this computation, and this is standing about at 120 lakh crores. And we are indeed quite happy to note that the government need not make the bulk of investment, because there is certainly a squeeze on the resources, and despite Mahatma Gandhi Narega as well as the NRLM urban programs making very substantial investment, clearly the investment that could come from our program or the programs of the other ministries and the state governments would not be so much as to kind of meet the entire need of the investment. And the fact that most of these investments can come from the variety of sectors, the corporates, the stock market, and so on, and the financial institution, and these could be woven into the business model that make this possible, and this has indeed been demonstrated. Is a very happy augury for us to be able to realize the dream for livelihood for all, indeed in about 10 years' time. I thank Mr. Sharma and the colleagues to provide me an opportunity of expanding and elaborating our thoughts on this important area, and we hope that the participants will dwell in greater detail on these issues, and their recommendations and inputs would become available to us. We also hope that many of the partners and discussants would come forward to share their thoughts with us, strike partnership for ensuring and realizing the goal of livelihood for all the women and all the households in the rural and the urban areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for your inspiring inaugural address and sharing your vision for rural development and poverty reduction. With this, we come to the end of the inaugural of the two-day summit. I take this opportunity to thank all esteemed speakers of the panel. for setting in motion the Virtual Livelihoods India Summit to 2020. Once again, a very warm welcome to everyone who is logged into the platform. We'll take a very short break and then begin with the opening plenary in a couple of minutes.
I'm going to take an appointment again.
Sure.
Please stay logged into the same virtual meeting room for the next session, Future of India's Livelihoods Vision 2030.